In this members upload, I'm going to talk about Sulawesi, my time there, and the inspiration behind the first story in the South Sea cycle of stories, which is Setan Besar. If you watched the video on Lawton, I'll also be telling a sort of similar story around the end of this upload where I talk about a strange experience I had while there, which, while not entirely inexplicable, is eerie. It's never really made it into a story, but it was a strange thing to go through, and I think it might do to tell it as sort of a virtual campfire story here. So I went to Sulawesi during a time period where I was toying with the idea of teaching English in Southeast Asia. And one of the things I was going to do to practice for this and potentially later land jobs doing it was volunteer teaching or tutoring English and just take a trip there for a month and see if I could get into the swing of things, and then maybe after that come back and live relatively inexpensively, make good pay. It also helped that I had a historical interest in Indonesia, the Indonesian archipelago, Malaysia, the entire Malay world, really, especially prior to contact with the Dutch or the British, the Spanish, etc. A lot of those kingdoms like Srivijaya and Majapahit that existed there prior to the colonial period are interesting to me organizationally. And the religious practices, the kind of adaptations of Buddhism and Hinduism that existed there are also very strange, very different than those faiths as they existed in India prior to coming there. The architecture, the monuments like Borobudur or any of the older kind of temples and palaces in that landscape are quite striking. So another bonus to going there was that I could practice Indonesian and Javanese and other local languages and get to grips with vocabulary and usage in a way that I wouldn't be able to just academically studying them from far away. So all this to say, when I got to Sulawesi, I was lined up through a site called Workaway to meet up with a guy, Basak, who is a character in that story. Nice guy, very jovial, excitable dude. He ended up taking me to the region he came from, far north of Makassar, the biggest city on Sulawesi. And we ended up staying with family members of his, a big family. Two couples and a lot of their daughters, and one uncle that was unmarried and had no children, plus Basak, who I think was a younger cousin of one of these. The idea of the assignment was that, the idea of the listing, I guess I should say, was that I would be tutoring the younger people in this village, really this sort of homestead near the coast, in English. But that really wasn't what we ended up doing. I stayed up there for the better part of a week, and I was really just kind of hanging out with them and providing extra labor. The family had just bought this big tract of coastal land right next to the couple stilt huts that they lived in, and they were clearing the jungle right along the coast to raise animals and plant crops. So I was just helping them do that. We were working with fire and machetes to kind of clear out undergrowth and then a chainsaw to cut down trees. I was helping haul in crab pots, and they also had a sort of monopoly on fresh water along that tract of coastline, because the whole coastline was sort of very steep mountains choked with jungle, and there was no, other than rain, there's no source of fresh water except for little springs and creeks, and for miles in either direction, they had the only kind of freshwater mountain spring or creek that was coming down to hit the beach. So other families that lived along this stretch of coastline would come and buy water from them. So I was hauling water and helping with the fishing and that sort of thing. Very, other than just talking in English with the couple of the younger kids that knew a bit of English, there was not really much English tutoring going on, but it was a very, very interesting, very immersive experience. It helped me learn Indonesian far better than I think it helped anybody learn any English. And it was interesting to be out there in the middle of an environment where you were entire hours and hours removed from electricity, and you were living a method of life which, other than just engines on boats or little cans of gasoline for a chainsaw, you were living a mode of existence which would have been very familiar to somebody as much as 4,000 years ago. So it was an absolutely excellent experience, and I enjoyed myself immensely during that period. At certain times of year, the bay that we were on saw saltwater crocodiles coming through and beaching themselves, and there were a few skid marks from very big ones on the beach while I was there. And I remember being stricken by the fact that no one there was nervous about going to the bathroom in the surf or bathing in the seawater, despite the fact, I guess the water was crystal clear, so you would see if there was like a 16-foot long crocodile coming to check you out. It would be difficult for them to hide, but simultaneously I was kind of gobsmacked by how casual everybody was when the dinosaurs were out and about. But having said that, the spookiest thing that happened on the water while I was there, and it wasn't any sort of direct encounter I had, far spookier than even knowing that the crocodiles were around and glimpsing them occasionally when you're out doing crab potting and stuff like that. Far spookier than that was we went out to one of these fishing platforms. That whole area of the coast of Sulawesi is dotted with these little sort of almost piers floating out on the water. I shouldn't say floating. They're on stilts in the shallows, but they're effectively piers divorced from the coast with big dip nets for either breeding fish or hauling up, like trawling things from the bottom, hung in the middle of them. So they're kind of constructed in rectangles or squares with big gaps in the middle. I was told that back prior to the 1900s, when fewer people had left for bigger cities on Sulawesi, there were whole communities that lived on platforms like that. And one of those shows up in the context of the story. I've just photoshopped it into modernity. Those technically at that scale don't exist anymore, but it was kind of a too cool an image for me not to make use of it. But having said that, families still do live out on these platforms. So you'll see, a couple with their children or a few brothers set up shop out here, and they will live on the platforms for, a week or two at a time, and then go back to whatever home that they maintain on the shore and maybe sell what they're getting, to transit it up the coast to a town or a city to market it, whatever. So we were running, one of the afternoons I was out there, we were running water from the stream in barrels out to these platforms to sell water to the fishermen, because they had a few deliveries organized every afternoon where they would take a barrel out to this platform and a barrel out to that platform, etc. And these were long trips. You'd be gone for 3-4 hours out and 3-4 hours back, and you'd get back after dark, generally. Well after dark. And I remember a couple afternoons we went out for delivery runs like that, but I only went, I think, 3 times on these delivery runs, and the last of them, during the last of these runs, close to when I departed, it became evident as we went from platform to platform that a lot of these guys were packing up and getting ready to go and leave. And I assumed it was just, it was coming to the end of the week. Maybe they're going off for the weekend to sell things. But Basak also seemed surprised that everybody was leaving, and he said that it was not normal for them to be departing at this time, that they were leaving early, and he didn't understand. So when we got to our last stop for the day, he asked why everybody was heading out. He asked the guy. It was one older guy that was running this platform all on his own. He had a couple dogs on the platform with him, and he asked him why he was leaving, why everybody was leaving. And this old guy told him that they had seen lights on the bay the night before. And he then advised that we we camp on the coast rather than boating back the 3 or 4 hours to Bosuk's family's, little outpost, homestead. Because he said when the lights are out there in the bay, it's not safe to be out there on the bay. And Bosuk said this was silly, and we boated back, and we didn't see any lights, and nothing happened to us. We got home, and we're just fine. But having said that, I was a little on edge for that entire 3 or 4 hour ride that we took back in the dark, because it was almost sunset when we went to that last platform. And it struck me as very odd that all of these people were leaving platforms early. They were giving up work. They don't have a lot of income, and they're giving up what little income they have, at least for the time being, just because they've seen something out on the water. So that got my noggin jogging, and I ended up riding Seitan Besar off the back of that experience. And now it's grown into something much more sizable. The kind of mythos behind it, beyond just being a big octopus or whatever, has gotten ever more expanded with things like the rig or the Makassar story. So, but the real, even spookier than that, the spookiest thing that occurred while I was there, period, happened on land and had nothing to do with the water. I got sick while I was there. I've had appendicitis now down the road and got the appendix out. And I think retrospectively, when I did have the appendectomy, the surgeon told me that there was a lot of scar tissue around my appendix, and he thought that I had probably had kind of bouts of appendicitis or flare-ups like that before that had just been very minor and subsided on their own prior to that final flare-up that was bad enough that I went to the ER. And I imagine retrospectively that what I was sick with, quote unquote, in Sulawesi that week that I was up there on that homestead with Bosuk was appendicitis. It felt very, I had, a sort of dull stabbing pain in my stomach, kind of off to the side. I felt nauseous. I felt weak. And I had trouble sleeping for the last 3 nights I was there. I couldn't really have bowel movements. I wasn't eating. And that's what ended up spurring me to go back to Makassar. I ended up getting a boat ride to a bigger town and getting on a bus to go back to Makassar right after this last night that this weird experience happened on. But anyway, I'd been sick at this point and sleepless for a few days. And I knew at that point that I was going to leave the next day. I had kind of organized for Bosuk to boat me out to this town and get me out of there. So I was just waiting, really, for morning to come, not expecting to get any sleep. It was probably, I didn't have my phone. It had died like days before that, so I didn't have a charged phone to use. I don't really know what time it was. It was probably past midnight, 1 or 2 hours past midnight. It felt like it was another 3 or 4 hours until the sun rose, so let's say like 2 to 4 a.m. is probably a good guess as to when this was. And it didn't feel good to lay down. It felt good to pace, to be up and pace. So when it kind of became evident I wasn't going to be able to sleep, I decided that I was going to get up and walk, just burn time until morning. And I like to walk at night back home. It was a crystal clear night there. It was almost a full moon. I think it had just been a full moon a night or two before. So the moon was still very bright, very large, and the sky was crystal clear. So it was almost, dusky in terms of the level of light. You could see very well. So I got up and put on my flip-flops and was walking around the compound there. And I decided that I was going to take there was a trail that led from the homestead up the very steep hillside, kind of following the route of the stream that brought fresh water down from the top of this ridge. And you could go all the way up there, crest the ridge, and then come out and be viewing the neighboring bay. So this big sort of spear of land that jutted out from the coast, you could go up over the ridge and kind of see the other side into the neighboring bay. And it wasn't a terribly long walk. It was maybe 1.5 miles, all told. You could go all the way out over the ridge, get to the beach on the other side, and then walk all the way back in, an hour and 20 minutes. So it wasn't a horribly long walk. And it wasn't treacherous either. It was a very, it was muddy in spots, but it was a very well-worn path. There had once, I think they said, been another family that lived on the bay over there, but had moved away. And there was nothing really left of that. That neighboring bay was where we were going every day to clear growth, to clear jungle. So I was familiar with the route. It wasn't, I had walked it even nights before that. I had walked this route when it was bright and clear. So I didn't really think anything of it. As I say, I'm a consummate night walker and pacer, especially when I'm thinking or I can't sleep. So I figured I was just going to go and take a laid-back walk up over the ridge and see the neighboring bay. Nothing more to it than that. Well, it was a very nice walk all the way up to the top of the ridge. But the second I crested the ridge and started to descend towards the beach of the neighboring bay, everything was quiet. Suddenly, all of the bird noise, and the second I kind of crested that hill and started moving down the opposite side, there was no bug song, no bird song. There was no, none of this sort of monkey chattering that was going on in the jungle all the time, especially at night over there. It was just wind. It was just wind off the coast and the sound of waves hitting the beach. Very, very strangely quiet. I've heard this sort of thing described a lot by people that hike or hunt, but this is the only time I have ever experienced it occurring in real life. This sort of sudden, very icy, unnerving silence coming over a very loud wilderland area and just seemingly out of nowhere. And the common explanation you hear for this when you hear hikers or mountaineers or whatever talk about having experienced this quiet or this silence is predators. That this silence represents that, say, a mountain lion or a tiger or a big bear or something of that nature is in the area with you. Or alternatively, you've wandered into the path of this thing, and the forest is quiet around you because the wildlife knows that something's off, but you don't. I mean, your first clue that something's off is that it's very quiet. And that's I guess, a rational explanation, but it doesn't make it any less unnerving. But jointly, even then, I knew part of the reason why I was so confident in walking, I wasn't armed. It wasn't like being at home. I didn't have, a firearm or even a knife. I suppose I could have carried a machete up there, but I didn't even do that. So the reason I was so confident in being that naked, I guess, if you want to put it in defense terms, is that there are no big predators on Sulawesi. There are no, there's not even really monkeys of size that could be aggressive towards you. Everything is, there are some poisonous snakes, but nothing is going to run out of the jungle and drag you off. There's no Sumatran tiger or anything like that bumping around on Sulawesi. And there really aren't any predators larger than like a large house cat on the island. and haven't been for centuries and centuries and centuries. I realized that recently the Javanese tiger, which was assumed to be wiped out in the wild on Java, has been spotted pretty reliably in a few places. I don't know that there were ever tigers on Sulawesi, but if so, like the Javanese tiger, they should realistically be gone by this point. I had never been warned about any wildlife that wasn't in the water. So it strikes me as strange. I don't know that I buy that it was purely some sort of predatory silence that I was walking into. There isn't really anything there that I think could inspire that level of even down to the whatever amounts to the cricket. I don't know if you would call the local cricket noise bugs crickets, but whatever amounts to even down to them, that level of stone cold silence just did not feel right. And I felt as if I was at risk. I turned around about 50 yards down the opposite side of the hill and went all the way back, which I've never done in any other. I've never felt bad about a situation, even going into an abandoned building or a mine or what. I have never felt uneasy and just turned around and left. Generally, if I feel a little creeped out by an environment, if anything, that's more of a motivation for me to go deeper and try to find out why I'm feeling unnerved, or it's almost a challenge to me. So, but I felt very, very uneasy, and I didn't hear or see, other than the silence, anything out of the ordinary. But that experience has stuck with me right up till now, all these many years later. And I still can't exactly explain how it came about or what was going on there or why I felt the way I did, but I did turn tail and get out of there. On a more recent trip, this one to the Philippines, I had a similarly eerie encounter in a very this was with a person, but in a very different context. And the next story that's coming up which is a good distance towards being finished at this point, is inspired by this other strange experience in the Philippines. So another South Sea story is coming. Hopefully by the end of March, but April at the latest. And for those of you that enjoy the sort of oceanic stories, you'll have a very long one. I imagine this one will be a couple hours long. As I've said before, I can't. It's very difficult for me to stick to a short story format. It's been a long time since I've been able to just bang out a 20-minute story or something like that. So. But I do enjoy them. I'm confident with what I'm producing at the moment.